Hello and welcome to a new episode of the CTO show with Mehmet. My name is Mehmet. I share daily insights about latest trends in technology while discussing their business benefits. I also sometimes feature startup founders and entrepreneurs and what they are trying to solve. Today it's quite different. I have actually a CTO with me on the show. I have Doug Squirrel, who's joining me from England, and we will be having, I'm sure, a very engaging and very interesting discussion. So before we start, thank you, Doug, for joining me on the show today. Can you just introduce yourself to the podcast listener and to the YouTube viewers as well?
I sure can. Hi, my name is Squirrel, and I'm, as I was just telling Mehmet, I'm sitting in my 600-year-old house in England, and it's not the best setup for podcasting, but I think we figured it out, so it's working well. My background is 40 years of coding, probably 45 now, and 20-odd years of being some form of technical leader. The interesting thing about my history as an employed technical leader is I got fired every time, over and over again. And it was in the nicest possible way. The founders would come along and say, Squirrel, you've built this amazing team and they're building the software we need. And there's a leader you've trained and that person's really doing great. And the team is really functioning without you. And there's really not much for you to do. And gosh, you're always very expensive, Squirrel. Maybe you can go and be wonderful somewhere else. And it was a really nice way to get fired. But the third or fourth time I said, hang on a second, there's a pattern here. So, and what was interesting was it got shorter each time. So the first time took about 10 years, and the second time took about 2, and the third time took about 1. And I said, well, maybe I'm getting better at helping teams get better. So then I became a consultant. And so now I work with lots of CTOs and others, CEOs, COOs, salespeople, you name it. I coach them and help them. And what I do is I help them very, very rapidly. So I've worked with about, I think it's up to 185 in the last 8 years or so. So if you do the maths, I get through them very quickly. I help quickly, I get out of the way, I transfer the skills, and I help the team be much more profitable very fast.
Oh, wow. That's really an impressive history, I would say. Yeah, and I'm sure I'm sure you're doing the job very well. So if they are giving you this feedback and then telling you thank you, of course you're doing the best. So I'm interested to know because you have a long history. When I was checking your profile, so what attracted you to technology back in the days? I would say that's the first question.
Wow, what a great question, because it goes back to when I was 6 years old. And my father and mother gave me a computer, one of the very, very first home computers, the TRS-80, for anybody who knows this kind of thing. The BBC Micro was a similar kind. Apple I or Apple II were similar. And the amazing thing for me at that time was the machine was predictable. The machine would always do the same thing. And the universe doesn't seem to do that. I pick up a pen, and half the time because I'm very clumsy, I'd pick up a pen and I drop it or something else happens. It's not predictable. Whereas in a game that I might be playing on that computer, pick up pen, which is what you type in at that time, it always resulted in you picking up the pen. So I really liked that predictability, the certainty that you got from computers. That's ironic because now what I do is I help people deal with tremendous uncertainty in their businesses and build software in a way that allows them to experiment a lot when they don't know things. But I still like the certainty that you get from the machine itself.
That's also like inspiring story, I would say. And I think when these generations of computers came out, I was still crawling probably. So, but yeah, I get what you
we
mean.
don't have to date you. That's okay. Or me.
But
I feel old.
I'm old as well. So I have to agree with you because, one of the things that also attracted me to computers in general is that you give them the instructions and then you expect them to do the instructions as you gave them. So
yes,
that's quite good. So what was the first, I believe, was it like BASIC, the first programming language that you have ever used at that time?
That's what I worked in. Yep. Then assembler.
Oh, okay. That's cool. What was the first, I would say, program that you have wrote?
First program. Now that would have been a long time ago. Some hello world or print my name on the screen
The traditional
over and
stuff.
over again. But the first real program this was the days when you would record things on a cassette tape, a little thing that you'd push into the computer that could play music, but in fact you'd record these tones on it as the program. We didn't have discs. And you would send these cassette tapes to someone trying to get it published. So I did this at the age of 7 or 8 for a program that actually, there were a couple. There was one that you were a flying creature and you ran around and picked things up, standard video game of that era, and another that simulated a Turing machine. So nobody ever published my programs, strangely. They weren't very good, but that it was interesting, enlightening experience. And kind of like the internet today, nobody knew I was 8 years old. So I would send these things off, and all they were getting was the cassette tape and a little message that said, "Hi, please publish my program." They didn't, and they'd write back to me as if I was an adult. And that was a very interesting experience.
Yeah, indeed it is. So I'm now more interested to understand, because, you know, I'm also, the first thing I was exposed to was Pascal and then Basic. So, but of course, over, you know, the years, technology changed, language changed. So from a CTO perspective, like how you were able to keep, you know, up with the trends, I would say, up with the new technologies. And if you can give an advice, because I'm sure whatever we have today, maybe in, I would not say 10 years, maybe after 5 years, we will not have it.
Yeah. Well, in all of my adult life, the web was available. So I went to university around the 1990 period, and in there we were just developing the web, so it was very new, but it had a lot of interesting things on it which I would keep track of. I mean, I guess before then I read computer magazines, and that kept me up to date. But what I noticed that was interesting was that back in the 1990s, you could literally list almost every web page on the web. There were pages that were just lists of links, and I'd go and trawl those for the ones that seemed interesting. Nowadays, of course, you couldn't possibly keep up, but there were different, it continued to be these different filters. I mean, Craigslist came from a similar thing. Craig would just send out a list of interesting stuff every week, and people seemed to like it, and that's where he got his list from. But these have evolved. So there was one called Slashdot, which was named because it was intentionally hard to say. And that was a place that people found information after some of those first lists of links, after it got too big to keep track. Then Hacker News came in, and we got Reddit. And those are the main Hacker News is now the main place that I go for anything important in tech. I will get there. I'm sure it will make its way there. But I've noticed this evolution where the kind of the cognoscenti appear in a certain place, and then it'll become less cool. You know, nobody wants to go to that club anymore because it's too crowded, right? It's too popular. And so then they'll go to someplace else. So it's about time for people to move on from Hacker News, I think, but I don't know what's coming next.
Cool. Now I'll ask a different question. So when we say CTO, you know, many things comes to mind. So sometimes people think that a CTO in a traditional organization is the guy who supervise all the technologies. In other contexts, we see the CTO as a co-founder for a startup, right? And sometimes the CTO can coexist with a CIO, and, you know, he just choose the technology while he gives the day-to-day operations to the CIO. From your perspective, because you have this long experience, how do you define exactly what a CTO does?
I don't. Although if you go to my website, you'll see if you stick on the website for 15 seconds or so, you'll get a little pop-up saying, would you like a document on what a CTO does? What I say in that document is the CTO does kind of whatever a CTO does. It is very funny. My very first role as a CTO, I got in an unusual way. The company I was working for hadn't had any technology people in it. I just happened to be one doing another type of role. And they said, "Hey, Squirrel, you know how to do this thing called programming. Would you do some of that for us? Because we're changing our business." We had spun out from another company. And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." And they said, "And also, we'll get you a new business card because we need a new name on our business cards from not the old company." I said, "That's fine." A week later, the founder comes to me and says, "Okay, Squirrel, here's your new business card." And I looked at it and it said CTO on it. And I said, "Well, I don't know what that is, but I guess I better figure it out because I've never been one of those before." And that's how it normally is for almost any CTO. The traditional, super traditional model is one of the ones that you described, where the CTO is mainly in charge of technology in some form. But some CTOs manage a technology team. Some of them manage a product team. Some of them have responsibility for customer service. Completely weird, but I've certainly seen that. Some CTOs are more kind of the crazy guy in the attic, the one who knows how to do everything and knows where all the bodies are buried, but you wouldn't let him near any engineers. You wouldn't let him near any management responsibilities. And you have some VP of engineering who takes care of that. And there are other more far afield models as well. So I never know when somebody says to me, I'm a CTO, I say, great. So if I followed you around all day, what would I see you do? And that's what tells me what they're doing. If they say, oh, yeah, I'm playing around with the hardware and I'm trying to build the next Internet of Things revolutionary product, I'm putting ChatGPT in a lamp, then I say, oh, you're the technological side. You're the one doing the art, research and development. If they say, well, yeah, you'd see me going to one-on-ones and coming up with new processes and talking to customers, I'd say, oh, you're on the leadership side. There are huge numbers of options in the middle. So sorry, I can't tell you. If somebody finds out, please let me know.
Yeah, probably. I have to agree with you honestly on this. I've never been a CTO, but I met a lot of CTOs, and the context change, as you say. Like it depends. Are you the guy who's, as we call them, the core techie guys? They like to type and code, or are you just the guy who's managing teams and giving directions and so on? So yeah, I think I agree with you. It depends on the context that the role is driving them to do.
Mhm.
Now, but in all cases, and I think this will relate, like at some stage, technical people, even they become CTOs in whatever context, they need to manage people. And this is something because I was also on your website, and I think this is one of the areas where you help customers to overcome is how someone who's really from a techie background, and I shared something on another episode the other day, because I had a public speaking coach as well, and we were discussing that usually techie people are introverts by nature. So
me for sure. Yep.
yeah, same here. So how do you think like this can evolve? Like how they can become better managers in your opinion?
So surprisingly, the introversion is actually an advantage in certain ways because you have a sort of introspective nature. You tend to think before you speak, which is a very helpful characteristic. And that's true of anybody who has that kind of characteristic. Us engineers, we have some particular positive characteristics, some particular things that really help us. So again, surprisingly, kind of counterintuitively, the discreteness or the concreteness, the certainty that we were talking about at the beginning, that turns out to be very helpful when you want to be disciplined about your conversations. And I wrote a whole book called Agile Conversations with my co-author on how to use your technical skill, how to use things that like test-driven development to help you have better conversations. And it turns out that if you work hard at this, if you are disciplined and thoughtful and view a conversation as an entity that you can improve, almost like a computer program that you can debug, then you can improve it a lot. And I find when I coach salespeople or operations or CEOs that they have more trouble with that, whereas the CTOs get it immediately. They say, "Oh, great! So there's a recipe, there's a program, there's a set of things I need to do. Step one, step two, well, I know how to do that." So that can be enormously helpful for the skills for acquiring the skills that go into being a manager. The problem comes in, unfortunately, that if you aren't disciplined, if you aren't thoughtful about it, and you try to deal with people the same way you deal with computers, you will have a lot of trouble because the computers, unfortunately, are the ones that are super predictable, and the people are really not something you can control in any way. So many engineers that I work with say, I'm just so frustrated. Why won't they listen to me? I know that the code is bad. I know that we need to address the technical debt. I know that we need to, Squirrel, how can I convince them? And I say, well, actually, the first thing you have to do is stop trying to convince them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the part about the predictability. I agree with you. This is again machines you can play, although they throw some bugs or errors from time to
But
time.
there's
But
always a reason. There's always something you can trace back. Human beings, you can't.
yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Like you can't trace that back, but the human beings, it's a little bit of challenge. Now,
If only we had back traces, stack traces for humans, it would help a lot.
yes, yes. Now from coming back to developing, I mean, or writing software or producing software, because I had also a discussion in another episode about what really the main thing as a CTO and whatever context you want to take it in, what really they need to focus on so their customers will say, hey, you know what, you're doing fantastic job. Your product is really up to my expectations. So what are, if you can give from your experience some hints for younger people who might be watching or listening to us?
They don't have to be younger. Unfortunately, old people make exactly the same mistakes as younger people. So the age is not the issue. The thing that is absolutely consistent is the cycle time. If you can get a good cycle time, and I'll say what that is in a second, it's not what Jira tells you your cycle time is. If you can get a very fast cycle time, you almost can't fail with your customers. You could find out you've got completely the wrong product and your customers don't care about it, but that would be good. I'd rather know that today than 6 months from now. The problem is that because of this wish for certainty, this experience that we have with computers, that if we can just get everything right, we can understand all the things the computer program is supposed to do, then we can write the computer program correctly. The problem is that the humans who are using our computer program are not specified in that way. They're kind of blobs of conflicting wants, and getting a coherent set of specifications from them is literally impossible. There are huge books in psychology on how difficult it is even to define what a piece of furniture is. Humans just don't agree on that. If you're curious, ask yourself whether a clock is a piece of furniture. If you ask 10 friends, 5 of them will tell you one thing and 5 will tell you the other, because humans don't define things that way. So the thing you need to do is get your cycle time down. Cycle time is the period between when you begin to work on a thing, when you say, I'm really going to do this, not it's just kind of in my backlog somewhere, but it's here, I'm going to work on it, it's the next thing we're working on, next thing we're going to do, and the time when a customer sees it. And ideally, that time would be 1 day. So the moment you think of it, you go, hey, customer, what do you think? This is why, by the way, small startups are so incredibly productive, because typically there's somebody who's a customer representative working right there. It's typically one of the founders. Often it's the CTO. So they can kind of ask themselves, well, would I want this? Well, I'd want that. Okay, I'll do that. And so they go off and do this activity, and the cycle time's like 3 minutes. But even in a much, much larger organization, you can get to cycle times of a day, 2 days, even in my biotech customers, where they're building things that deal with medical items. Those people are able to do cycle times of 2 weeks, which is revolutionary in that world. To be able to turn around something that has a medical implication in 2 weeks. But if you can, you get this incredible feedback from your customer, and you find out very often that exactly what you were defining so carefully, what you were estimating, what you were working out in such detail is complete rubbish. It's not at all what the customer wants. And it's much better to give them a bad version and let them tell you what's wrong with it and get that out quickly than to get them a perfect version that has been thoroughly thought through and makes them totally happy, because guess what? It never does.
Yeah, 100%. You cannot make everyone happy, but at least if I'm a fan of the agile / lean models,
Notice I didn't say agile or lean anywhere in that. So there are lots of people who are doing lots of agile things, and I'm sure they're doing great stuff, and it's very valuable, but their cycle times are 2 years.
Yeah, the speed is
because remember, it's getting to the customer. They might say, oh yes, we finished our sprint and now here's our new piece of code, and it's ready for us to add to the big pile that we're going to release at the end of the year. Yeah. That's a very common agile approach, and it's not what I'm advocating here. A fancy name for this actually comes from a guy named Alistair Coburn, who is one of the Agile Manifesto signatories, and he called it, and I call it, elephant carpaccio. You take your giant piece of code, your giant thing that you're going to build, and you slice it into pieces so thin that you can see through them. They're just tiny, tiny, tiny slices, but they all look like an elephant. Everything along the way is a successful customer shareable, customer valuable piece. And there's an art to that, but it's not that difficult.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, like you shared that you have a podcast yourself. So what's the theme of your podcast?
Well, that's a funny thing. It has an odd title. It's called Troubleshooting Agile, and that's because my co-author and I used to teach courses in this direction, where we'd help people with their Agile teams. And in fact, we talk about a lot more things than Agile development. And we are not only troubleshooting things, we also have new ideas. But it's called that. A possibly better title would be the same as our book, which is Agile Conversations. But annoyingly, somebody owned agileconversations.com when we got started. So now we own that. So agileconversations.com is ours. But at the time, we had to pick something else, and that's what we picked.
Oh, okay. That's cool. By the way, like I will be sharing the profile, I mean, the LinkedIn profile. I will share the podcast link as well with my listeners and my
Thank you.
viewers. Yeah, sure. Before we wrap up, and this is a traditional question that I'm starting to ask every single guest on my show. What is your view on what's next in tech? Whether the hype of AI, whether it's I know that maybe you would not like it. I'm just thinking maybe the no code revolution. So what's your view? What's your expectations about the next trends and directions?
Well, sure. There's just too many to keep track of. The main thing that's going to happen is that people will keep coming up with crazy innovations. The main thing that's driving all this, by the way, is just the availability of compute power. So we've made it really a commodity, and it's never an issue anymore. When I look at companies in due diligence, for example, so I'm assessing for a venture capitalist how the company is doing. When I look at one of those, we're never considering, well, how can we get the fanciest servers, which machines, which manufacturers are making the fastest machines. That's what the concerns were in 2000. I remember sitting in a scalability center owned by Sun, rest in peace, Sun, and we were exactly tuning which Sun servers we were going to use. We were trying to build our software so it could run the fastest. You would never do that today. You would just say, okay, Amazon or Azure or whoever you're using, go give me another virtual machine. And if it's a little bit too small, you get another one. That the cost is nearly zero. And you don't care anything about it except how many CPUs, whether there's a GPU and so on. So that availability of compute is what's driving things like ChatGPT, because we can suddenly do 10 billion parameters where previously you would have had to work very hard to get a Cray supercomputer or something to do that. Mm-hmm. The availability of what literally are supercomputers in our pockets now. So your phone can do more than those machines that I was working with in 2000, which is astonishing. The no-code revolution comes from the fact that we all have computers and people understand how to use them. So you can actually give people, say, a Shopify front end or a WordPress login, and suddenly they can create things that, again, in 1995 would have taken a whole team, a year, and a data center and a huge investment. So it's really the ubiquity of technology, I think, and the commodification of it that's driving all of these things.
Yeah. Last thing before we close, I know that you run a community. Is that right?
Very good. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was trying to think of a way to mention it just because I think it would be interesting to your listeners. And that's called the Squirrel Squadron. And that's my initiative. It's my way to give back. Everything's free. It's not part of my my business or my consulting, although you can talk to me about that if you want. But the community is all about getting tech and non-tech people together and having conversations. And astonishingly, there just doesn't seem to be a community in which that happens very much. There are lots of tech communities, and there are lots of operational communities and founder communities and so on. But people who come together like that just doesn't seem to happen. So I run free events every week. I run a forum on which people ask probing questions about all these tech trends we've just been talking about. And low code, we were just discussing low code last week, and do lots of other events and activities that are related to that. So that's at squirrelsquadron.com. And I'd love for your listeners to check it out and come to some events if they'd like to.
Yeah, sure. I will be also sharing that link.
Thank you.
In both the episode details and on the YouTube details as well. Well, Squirrel, that was a very nice conversation. Thank you for jumping in today for this episode.
Happy to. It was fun.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for watching us. If you are listening from your podcast apps, thank you for listening to us today. And we will be again together in another episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. And until then, we'll see you. Bye-bye.